Now, with the conclusion of the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, what we essentially see here is that Japan has reached the limits of what it's going to be able to achieve by simply bullying around its Asian neighbors, okay? To sort of put it like that. You've already incorporated the Ainu on the island of Hokkaido, the Ryukyuans, today the Okinawans, Taiwan. You've asserted your influence in Japan and, in Korea, and pushed out the Qing Empire. You pushed out the Chinese, but then you couldn't actually consolidate your foothold on the Korean peninsula because of who? The Europeans, more specifically the Russians. So now what the Japanese leaders realize is that we've sort of reached the limits of what we can do unless we are prepared to take on and ultimately displace Western imperialism on the East Asian mainland. Okay? We need living space, living room. We need room to expand. We need those natural resources. That's not so much in the Korean Peninsula, because the Korean Peninsula is densely populated. It's in Manchuria. It's in northeastern China. So to gain access to northeastern China, sure, you had to go through Korea, but you're also going to have to deal with those European powers that are already predominant in the regions closest to Japan and Korea. This means the Russians. All right, it was the Russians, too, who prevented the Japanese from being able to sort of formally take over Korea. The Russians dominate Manchuria. They dominate the Far East, Siberia. And they also have their own treaty port concessions in the Qing Empire as well. The most important one from the perspective of the Japanese is what was known in English as Port Arthur, in Chinese as Dalian. Dalian, or Port Arthur, is a very strategic city, a treaty port concession that the Russians held. It's right on the tip of a peninsula on the northern part of the Bohai Gulf on the maritime approach to Beijing. So as you can see here, you got Shandong to the south, the Port Arthur to the north, and north of that is going to be Manchuria. Very strategic position. It's a place where you could have sort of some influence in the maritime approach to Beijing. That's obviously very, very important, but it's also a place that's on the mainland. It's on the Chinese mainland, and it can be sort of a staging ground to expand your influence north overland into Manchuria, which is what the Japanese really want. Now the Russians are there. So, when are you going to get an opportunity to confront the Russians? You just don't declare war. There has to be some sort of pretext. The pretext is going to occur in 1901. This actually originally has very little to do with Japan. This has to do with the Qing Empire. We don't want to get into the details here. It'd be way too confusing, but it's the Boxer War. The Boxer War. Another one of these crippling wars that, no breathing room whatsoever for the Qing Empire on the mainland. One war after another, each one followed by territorial concessions, economic indemnities, and that leads to domestic unrest. That's a different subject. That's modern Chinese history. But from our perspective, what's important here is that the Boxer War in 1901 is yet another invasion. This time, 8 foreign empires, including Japan, invade Beijing to punish the Qing Empire and its betrayal of the Westerners. And after they defeat the Qing forces, they get more concessions from them. They impose a massive Boxer indemnity upon them. But most importantly, from Japan's perspective, they get the right to station their own troops in various parts of China wherever they have economic influence. This is the pretext. This is what all those 8 foreign empires said. They said, now the Qing Empire has proven itself unable to protect our life and limb and property. You've clearly shown this. You declared war on us. You had a peasant rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, that was directed against foreign missionaries, and then you piggybacked on them, declared war. So obviously you've shown yourself unfit and unreliable to protect the interest of foreign citizens in the Qing Empire. So we now are going to take the right to station our own troops wherever we have economic interest to look after our own communities. Obviously, this is going to be a great way to further meddle in the internal politics and economics of the Qing Empire. Now, what's important for us is that both the Russians and the Japanese station troops throughout the Northeast. Okay? Wherever we have citizens, we're allowed to station troops. And this comes to a head in 1904, when basically the Russians and the Japanese have their own troops stationed in northeastern China, Manchuria, and Korea, and neither one really is willing to give way. They both say, hey, you're supposed to be retreating, downsizing the number of your troops. You're not. Incident eventually breaks out. They go to war. All right, they go to war. And this is just as symbolic a war as the 1895 Sino-Japanese War as well. I mean, the results of it. In 1895, everyone was shocked. Whoa, the Japanese can defeat the Chinese? Are you kidding me? That was a big deal. This is almost an even bigger deal because Japan wins. They defeat the Russians. Now, granted, the Russians are fighting halfway around the world. They have to project their power. This is Japan's own backyard, but the result is still that Japan won. They didn't just defeat the long-standing powerhouse of Asia. They now defeated white-skinned Westerners, Russians. Symbolically, psychologically, this was also huge after 1905. Both to the Westerners, they're all looking at this and going, whoa, okay, the Russians, maybe they were the weakest of the Europeans, but they're still Europeans. They're still white skin, and they lost to Asians? My God, it was one thing when Japan defeated China, but now they've defeated white-skinned Russians. And then for the Japanese, of course, this is, we're defeating the Europeans now. We're no longer a step below them, where we're just bullying around other Asians. We have the potential. Maybe now we can only defeat the weakest of the Europeans, but we have the potential to go on the battlefield with anyone, even the original industrializers, and win. It's a huge confidence boost. It also influences a lot of people in Asia. They'll constantly look back to this and say, this is the first time we've ever seen Western imperialism reversed in the past, in our living memory. It never gets reversed. You've reversed it. You defeated the Russians and got concessions from them, not the other way around. Psychologically, that'll be big too. Japan will use this. They'll play this up later on. They'll say, hey, we're liberating Asia from European imperialism. Look, we've been doing it since 1905, and we're going to continue to do it. They, like to overlook the fact that they replaced it with their own imperialism, which was often just as bad, if not worse, and more exploitative than what the Westerners did. But nevertheless, that was the discourse that they used often to justify what they were doing elsewhere throughout Asia. We're liberating you, and we've been doing it for a long time. Now, what did they get after 1905? Well, now they're getting their foothold on the mainland. They're getting what Russia refused to grant them in 1895, Korea. All right, Korea is what they really wanted. The Japanese will now create a protectorate. They'll call it a protectorate. We're going to protect Korea from big bad outside enemies that prey on it. We're the biggest enemy, but nevertheless, protectorate in 1905, formally annex it in 1910. So now Korea, another big part of the Japanese empire. They get Port Arthur, Dalian, that was that big Russian treaty port concession, very, very strategic. And from Port Arthur, they will now be running what they will refer to as the South Manchurian Railroad. This is going to be how they extend economic influence into Manchuria, the rail line that the Russians had already started throughout Manchuria. Now the Japanese are taking over that, building on top of it, and wherever you have economic interest, political and military soldiers usually follow soon after that. Also, what they get in 1905 is what is known as Karafuto. This is something, a little known aspect of the Japanese Empire, because they'll eventually lose it. Karafuto is the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Sakhalin Island is the next big, very long island, the next big island north of Hokkaido. Now it entirely belongs to Russia. Previously, this was disputed. It could have been the fifth home island of the Japanese if they didn't lose it during World War II, but they will. And the Russians grant the southern half of Sakhalin Island, which the Japanese named Karafuto, and there's a modest amount of Japanese settlers actually make their way and settle on Karafuto as well. All right, now Japan is not done. All right, our topic here is how Japan began to displace Western imperialism in the opening decades of the 20th century. World War I is the next big opportunity. All right, World War I will lead to the withdrawal of most European resources and personnel throughout their colonies in Asia, just leaving behind a threadbare administration, colonial administration, to look after the most basic interests. Japan, strategically, will support the winners, offer logistical support to the winners of World War I, and as a result, they get the German former colonial concessions in China. In modern Chinese history, this is a big deal. It stimulates a lot of movements, the May 4th movement and whatnot. Nevertheless, from Japan's perspective, they had backroom dealings to say, if we support the winners, you're not going to give former German colonial concessions back to China. You give them to us. We want them, and we provided more in the war, so we should get them. The bottom line is Japan's more powerful than China. The Westerners are going to listen to Japan over China, and Japan takes over, the former German concessions in Shandong. And also, more importantly, perhaps for future strategic interest and competition with the United States is Micronesia, Pacific islands that the Germans had that now get handed over to the Japanese. And now they're also able to strengthen their stranglehold in Manchuria. It's not just the concessions from that they're able to get after World War I, what they took from the Germans. It is also the ability to expand in Manchuria. They submit what are known as the 21 demands to the Chinese administration in 1915, knowing the Europeans aren't going to intervene because they're far too distracted with World War I. The 21 demands submitted by the Japanese to the Chinese president Yuan Shikai in 1915 allows them to consolidate their colonial interests along the South Manchurian Railway in Manchuria. Japan at this point is getting so confident it even intervenes in the Russian Civil War in Siberia. Little known fact, many people don't know this because it was kind of a failure. They sent 70,000 troops to join the Americans and British armies to intervene in the Russian Civil War on the side of the White Russians, the royalists, the ones who were fighting the Bolsheviks in an attempt to sort of create a separate Russian non-communist state somewhere in Siberia. This eventually fails, and the Japanese side that they're supporting ends up losing, but it sort of goes to show the confidence now that Japan is having. It has its major foothold. It has Korea, it has Port Arthur, it has economic concessions through the South Manchurian Railroad, and they're ambitious. They're looking all the way to Siberia. If we can support a white Russian regime in Siberia, that would only be to our benefit. They lose, and it becomes sort of this obscure footnote in history. So, by 1915, the parameters of the Japanese Empire prior to 1937, World War II, invasion of China, are basically set. You've got your 4 home islands, with Hokkaido being recently integrated over the Ainu people. You've got the Ryukyuan archipelago with its largest island of Okinawa. You've got formerly Taiwan, acquired through direct conquest, a war with the Qing Empire. Now you've got Korea. You've got the southern half of Sakhalin Island to the north of Hokkaido. You've got Pacific Islands, which, although very small in territory, strategically are of the utmost importance. And you have major concessions in northern China. You've got your interest in Shandong province to the south of Beijing. You've got Manchuria, which are going to operate through the city of Dalian, Port Arthur, and through the South Manchurian Railroad. Now, at this point, when you've got sort of a stable Japanese empire for the next 15, 20 years until World War II, and sort of the formal siphoning off of Manchuria in the form of the puppet state of Manchukuo, is a good time to change gears and take a look at the ideologies of the Japanese Empire, which we'll do in the next videos. How did they conceptualize the empire themselves? Who were the Japanese? Who do we rule over? What are we doing here? What is the lofty discourse we're going to project to justify our imperial enterprise?